When we look at the headlines today, the narrative surrounding the world's second largest economy is often dominated by one word: collapse. Turn on any major financial news network and you'll hear about the death of the Chinese miracle, the implosion of the property market, and a demographic crisis that supposedly makes decline inevitable. But if we pull back the curtain and look at the actual structural shifts happening on the ground in 2026, a very different story emerges. China isn't collapsing, it is evolving. The era of easy growth, the kind fueled by building endless apartment blocks and low-end manufacturing, is indeed over. But in its place, Beijing is engineering the most ambitious economic pivot in human history. To understand why the collapse narrative is likely wrong, we have to look at how China is moving from a quantity-based economy to a quality-based superpower. In this video, we are going to dive into the hard data and real-world examples that show how China is defying the doomsday predictions. We will examine the transition to the new three industries, the reality of the property reset, the automation of the workforce, and why China's fortress-like self-reliance is making it more resilient than ever. The property reset and the rise of the new three. For years, the loudest argument for a Chinese collapse was the real estate crisis. It's true that property once accounted for nearly 30% of Chinese GDP, and the debt held by giants like Evergrande was staggering. But what the collapse theorists missed was that the Chinese government intentionally triggered this cooling period. They knew that a debt-fueled housing bubble was a long-term threat, so they shifted the country's capital away from empty apartments and toward advanced technology. Instead of saving the old property engine, China has replaced it with what they call the new three industries: electric vehicles, EVs, lithium-ion batteries, and solar energy. This isn't just a minor shift, it is a total industrial takeover. In 2025, China's EV exports surged by over 60% year over year. While Western car companies were struggling with high costs and supply chain issues, Chinese brands like BYD were producing cars that were not only more affordable, but technologically superior. Consider this data. By early 2026, China controls over 80% of the global supply chain for solar panels and nearly 60% of the world's EV battery production. When you control the green transition, you control the 21st century economy. The money that used to go into building ghost cities is now being funneled into high-tech manufacturing. While the West sees a crisis in real estate, Beijing sees a cleanup that allows them to focus on the industries that will dominate the next 50 years. China is trading bricks and mortar for silicon and lithium, and that is a trade that leads to growth, not collapse. The efficiency revolution, AI and automation. The second major collapse argument is demographics. Yes, China's population is aging and the workforce is shrinking. In any traditional economy, a smaller workforce means lower growth. But China is not a traditional economy. It is the most robot-dense nation on the planet. Instead of panicking about a lack of humans, China has decided to replace them with machines. In 2024 and 2025, China installed more industrial robots than the rest of the world combined. For every 10,000 workers, China now has hundreds of robots, a ratio that is growing exponentially. This is the robotic dividend. By automating everything from semiconductor assembly to port logistics, China is keeping its productivity high, even as its human population declines. Let's look at a real-world example. In the ports of Shanghai and Ningbo, we are seeing fully autonomous docks, where 5G-connected cranes move containers with zero human intervention. This makes the ports faster, cheaper, and immune to labor shortages. In the semiconductor world, Chinese AI is being used to design chips that are optimized for domestic machines, allowing them to get superpower performance out of hardware that the West tried to ban. China is proving that you don't need a massive population if your digital citizens never sleep, never strike, and never age.
The Fortress China strategy. One of the reasons many Western analysts predict a collapse is because they judge China by Western standards. They look at consumer spending and stock market performance as the only signs of health. But the Chinese leadership has a different priority: resilience. This is the Fortress China strategy. Over the last few years, China has been methodically cutting its ties to Western vulnerabilities. They have moved to settle their trade in yuan instead of dollars, particularly with energy giants like Saudi Arabia and Russia. By 2026, China has successfully built its own domestic versions of almost every critical technology. They have their own operating systems, their own cloud infrastructure, and their own semiconductor toolsets. This decoupling might slow down growth in the short term, which is why we see GDP growth at 4% or 5% instead of 10%, but it makes the economy sanction-proof. China is preparing for a world of high tension. By becoming self-reliant in food, energy, and tech, they are ensuring that they cannot be collapsed by external pressure. While the US and Europe are still deeply interconnected and vulnerable to global shocks, China is building a walled garden that is designed to stand firm regardless of what happens in the global financial system.
The Global South, a new market for growth. Finally, we have to look at where China is selling its products. The collapse narrative assumes that if the US and Europe stop buying from China, the Chinese economy dies. But that ignores the rise of the Global South. China's Belt and Road Initiative and its leadership in the BRICS Plus bloc have created a massive, loyal market across Southeast Asia, Africa, and Latin America. In 2025, China's trade with ASEAN countries surpassed its trade with either the US or the EU. This is a massive shift. While the West is trying to de-risk from China, the rest of the world is lining up to buy Chinese technology. For a developing nation in Africa or Southeast Asia, a Chinese-made EV or a Chinese-built 5G network is more affordable and easier to implement than Western alternatives. China is effectively becoming the department store for the developing world. By providing the infrastructure and the technology for the next 2 billion people entering the middle class, China is locking in growth for decades to come. They aren't just selling cheap toys anymore. They are selling the digital and physical infrastructure of the future. Why the giant still stands. So, back to the question. Is China's economy on the verge of collapse? The hard data says no. What we are seeing is not a collapse, but a transition. It is the end of quantity and the beginning of quality. Yes, the transition is messy. Yes, there are billions of dollars in debt being written off. And yes, the days of 10% growth are gone. But a 5% growth rate on an economy the size of China's still adds the equivalent of a whole new mid-sized European country to the global economy every few years. China is doubling down on the things that matter for the 2030s: AI, green energy, domestic resilience, and trade with the Global South. While the West waits for a collapse that never comes, China is quietly building a new kind of superpower, one that is smarter, more automated, and less dependent on the dollar. The Chinese miracle hasn't ended, it has simply changed its form. And for those who are paying attention, the rise of China is far from over. What do you think? Is the collapse narrative just wishful thinking by Western critics, or is there a hidden weakness we haven't seen? Join the discussion in the comments. We want to hear your analysis of the new Asian economy. If you found this strategic audit valuable, hit the like button and share this video with someone who needs a different perspective on global power. And to stay ahead of the curve, don't forget to subscribe to Rise of Asia. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.